I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me is Dr. Patrick Wyman, my steadfast co-host, and we are... Oh god, I got a lot of pressure on me now, Pat. I have to do a creative intro every week now. We are...
See, this is the problem with trying to set those kinds of standards, Connor. People will notice, and then they'll expect it.
This is the problem with trying. We are... Two thugs with ugly mugs on drugs talking about pugs. How's that?
Wait, we're going to talk about Mizuto Hirota?
Pug being short for fighter, okay? Talking about pugilists. We got to work with the rhyme scheme here.
Cool. All right. For sure.
Was it good? It didn't seem like it was that well received.
I've heard worse.
Have you? Okay. Yeah, you were being nice. Also, I apologize. You don't have an ugly mug, Pat. You're a handsome devil. Welcome to Heavy Hands. With your, you can just imagine us as being extremely handsome, both of us. You're very handsome hosts. We're here to talk about a whole different selection of fights. Pat, I'm going to be honest. Last week, we were not at all enthused about UFC Auckland. I don't think we were necessarily wrong to not be interested, because even now, looking over this card, I'm trying to wonder how it was actually as entertaining as it was. It is almost entirely bereft of any sort of relevance or name value. But watching it live, credit to the matchmaking and to the fighters, it was actually quite a good deal of fun to watch, especially the main card, which we did both agree was like fairly stacked with well-matched fights, just not, ones that really kind of got the blood pumping beforehand.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with treating cards like this where, like, they don't deserve a lot of attention beforehand. Like, there are too many fights nowadays to try and treat everything like it's equally meaningful. I think that's a huge analytical error, and I think as a fan who's just trying to consume the sport and enjoy it, I think it's the kind of thing that's going to lead you to a lot of disappointment if you try and get yourself up for every event. Like, yeah. And I think it's going to make more sense and you're going to enjoy the sport a lot more if you're like, not a lot that I really need to invest a lot of time thinking about beforehand, but it's on. It's going to be fun. The fights, like you mentioned, are well matched, and I think that's really one of the hallmarks of the Shelby Maynard era of matchmaking is that because they have more resources in terms of time devoted to making fights and thinking about these like less compelling matchups, we end up with a lot of really, really good, fun stuff. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be said for that, and I think it's one of the more positive developments of the UFC in late 2016, early 2017. Like, we're really seeing some stuff there. But like, this is the UFC's core product in some sense is not the big fights. It's like meaningless, fun fight night cards on a June Saturday from New Zealand.
Sure. Yeah, that's fair. And I say this, I used to make this comparison all the time, but if this had taken place in a boxing ring, if this was a Friday Night Fights card and I watched it and got this level of like action and interesting results, I would have been wholly satisfied. So I can't really complain. But I think, people listen to this show, far be it from me to suggest that we sometimes take a visceral subject matter and try to render it perhaps a little too academic. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing that from time to time. But also, people listen for our personalities, for the enthusiasm we have for the fights, right? That's why they listen to us breaking down fights and not now the myriad other various podcasts, some of them I believe are, which are copycats, which have popped up doing some similar stuff. And so, like, if we are looking at a card and we're really feeling bummed out by its existence, then that's part of the experience of getting the straight dope from us.
Yeah, on a basic level here, like, we're not going to lie to you about our perception of a card.
Right.
Or our analysis of a card. Like, if a card looks like shit, you don't want to have us breaking it down because our analysis is not going to be
We're not going to be into
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no sense at all in trying to force ourselves to do that. If it turns out to be a fun card afterward, after the fact, then absolutely we're going to talk about it. Like we're going to do here. Like this turned out to be a fun card, and there was some stuff to take from it after the fact, like the fact that Alex Volkanovski is a little freaking monster, and I enjoy watching him.
Yeah, well, actually, surprisingly, we do talk about the whole card just has this sense of irrelevance around it, and which is part of why we weren't interested. But there are two fighters who fought on this card who were, I think, going into it, we both knew had a bit of potential to maybe be serious prospects or, in the near future contenders in their divisions. And I think they really made the steps in the right direction. The first of those guys is Alexander Volkanovski, featherweight fighter. He is, I kept comparing him in my previews and on the Vivisection and everything to like a little Cain Velasquez, but I think the comparison is very strong. He's kind of small for a featherweight. He uses that his size to be extremely fast and to push an insane pace. He is truly, truly a very aggressive wrestle boxer. And like Cain Velasquez, he's not so much interested in just pinning someone in place on the ground as he is in sort of letting them scramble and just nailing them with shots in transition as they try to get out. And then because he has the initiative, he's in control, he's the one landing the shots. When they do finally struggle back to their feet, he's ready to take them right back down, get back in their half guard, and start piling on the shots. I thought this was a really good fight from him. He looked phenomenal, but he also had a very game opponent in the experienced Mizuta Hirota, who did not let him just sort of run away with an easy fight.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to be said for a young fighter in getting matchups like this, where you get a sense for your own limitations in terms of your ability to finish people. Because Volkanovski has been running through guys recently. Yeah. Like, he has been absolutely blasting them and destroying them. And you have to know, if you're going to be an elite fighter, that there are guys who can just take what you throw at them. Yeah. Like, that's really important. Like, that's a lesson that Mirsad Bektic had to learn against, it will hopefully have learned from his fight with Darren Elkins. Is like, you have got to come to terms with the fact that there are going to be guys that you're not going to be able to get out of there. And you've got to be able to tone it down and think hard about where you're at and what you're trying to do and what's going to get you a W, rather than trying to blow everybody out of the water with a barrage of punches. Because there are some guys who are just tough enough to take it, and Hirota is one of them. Hirota was crafty. He made Volkanovski work for it. He didn't make it easy. Hirota put together some good combinations, worked his way around, under, through Volkanovski's guard on the feet, and really made Volkanovski find like plan B and plan C. Because I don't think the way that he ended up beating Hirota was like what he was trying to do out of the gate. Hirota's scrambling forced Volkanovski to land those shots in transition. And that's something Volkanovski is good at doing anyway, but I think all other things being equal, he would have preferred to just sit on top of him and blast him with elbows until Hirota went to sleep. Sure. It's the fact that he prioritizes like standing and posturing up, which automatically means your control is not going to be as airtight as like a Luke Sanders or a Khabib Nurmagomedov. You're creating all that space for powerful strikes. But if he can posture up in half guard and you just cover up and stay there, he would absolutely take that over you scrambling. But he's very comfortable prioritizing the strikes on the ground and letting you move if that's what needs to happen. There's a new metagame emerging here that we can kind of start to see the outlines with guys like Volkanovski, and I think Khabib is kind of ahead of his time in that regard. Late career Maia is on that cutting edge too, and I think it's actually eventually going to be the answer to what fighters like Ioana Jędrzejczyk and Max Holloway and guys like and fighters like that are doing in terms of their like next generation sprawl and brawl, because you're not going to be able to get fighters like that down, right? Like their takedown defense is too good. You're not going to be able to hold them down. Their takedown defense is going to be too good. What you can do is hang on them and wear on them and force them to scramble and let them move under you and hit them while they try to move. And I think guys like Volkanovski are kind of blazing a new path in terms of that transitional offense there and their focus on it. Because you're right. Like I'm glad that you pointed to that, because that to me is one of the really stunning features of his game is like, if you want to scramble, Volkanovski's fine with that. He's just going to hit you 2 or 3 times really hard in the face and make you pay for it. Yeah. I mean, I have a ton of respect for Mizuto Hirota. I really thought he did a very, very credible job here. And I honestly expected that Volkanovski might be the first guy to knock him out.
And I'm going to do the underdogs this week with Phil, and you can better believe we will celebrate the crafty veteran performance of Hirota here. But one of the reasons I thought that Volkanovski was going to have that edge is because even knowing everything I know about Hirota, even knowing that he's extremely durable, that he has much better takedown defense than advertised, and that he is even more difficult to hold down, it was because of the style with which Volkanovski approaches the wrestle boxing game that I thought he would find an opening to knock Hirota out on the ground. And he came close a couple times. I mean, he definitely rung Hirota's bell, both on the feet and on the ground. There was one point, I think, where he was just sort of posting on Hirota's neck and just unloaded like 4 or 5 overhand rights from a fully postured standing position. And you got to marvel at Hirota's chin and his composure for fighting through something like that, because there were a lot of fighters that are not named Mizuto Hirota that would have become yet another knockout victim on Volkanovski's ledger.
Yeah, like a stain on the canvas at that point.
Yeah,
but
it was.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we both like Volkanovski. I think we're both real excited to see what he can do from this point. That is a talented young man right there.
Yeah, well, I said the other day, I said maybe because we were talking on Twitter about potential challengers to Max Holloway, trying to kind of figure out how far is this blessed era going to go, and who can be a tough challenge for Holloway that maybe, because he kind of ran through the top 10 on his way to the title. So who's waiting in the wings that could, in maybe a year or so, challenge him? And Mirsad Bektic obviously was a name that came up, but if Bektic can't sort out his stamina issues, which I think he probably can, I think it's more an issue of mental strength than it is physical. But if his chin continues to be a problem, which might be a more damning problem for him, then maybe Alexander Volkanovski is the guy who will bring that style to bear on Max Holloway, because he seems to have great stamina. He hits really, really hard, and he's got a very well integrated, aggressive ground game that really could be the one thing that Holloway is not really prepared for. So I think he is someone to watch in this division officially now.
Yeah, fundamentally agree with that. So there were a couple of really quick fights after that on the main card. There was Ben Nguyen versus Tim Elliott and Jan Cutelaba versus Enrique da Silva. Mm-hmm. And I don't have much to say about Nguyen's finish of Tim Elliott, but I have an observation. It's something I tweeted right after this. Mm-hmm. I think that fight is a really good reminder that dominant champions like Demetrius Johnson take everybody's best shot. Like, if your guys get up to fight the Demetrius Johnsons and Anderson Silvas and Joanna Jędrzejczyks of the world in a way that they don't get up to fight everybody else. And you could say this too about Kovalkiewicz versus Gadelia, like that. You know, if you're the champ, everybody is giving you everything that they've got, and like, you know, it's not like the guys that they're fighting are. I just think it's really important for us to bear that in mind, I guess.
No, I agree. I think that's a very, very salient point. The fact that, you know, we often see fighters too where their form really kind of falls apart after the title fight when you have a really dominant champion, and we've often attributed that to the champion over the course of the fight sort of breaking them, and I think that has something to do with it. But I think it's also that if you are broken in a fight and you've given it what you know is your best effort, which I think for most title challengers it is the best effort of their career, especially for that first title shot, you really kind of realize how much farther you have to go. That you put in all you could and you got beaten, and so you can't put in that kind of performance again. Now, Tim Elliott didn't look that way in his fight with Louis Smolka. He certainly looked like he still has something to offer, but we can see here, like, this was not, I thought, again, credit to Ben Nguyen. He came out very aggressive with his strikes. I think he rattled Tim Elliott a bit and then was just confident and composed and felt like he had the initiative, so he was able to control the ground game. But Tim Elliott had a hard time getting anything going in this fight, and that was certainly not the case when he was like the first guy in ages to make Demetrius Johnson look like a human being. So, yeah, I think that's a good point to raise. Let's talk about that Cutelaba fight, though. Of the two guys I mentioned who are fighters to watch in their divisions, I think, I'm guessing it's actually Iwan is how they were saying it live. Iwan Cutelaba. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at pronouncing Moldovan names. I don't know anything about that.
You're not big on you're not big on Moldovan. That's not an area of strength for you, Connor.
I mean, I like every young boy, I have been dreaming of going there for a vacation someday. But otherwise, no, I don't know much about it. Don't know much
So
about Moldova.
Moldovan is actually Romanian.
Oh,
It is
okay.
actually an Eastern Romance language, though unlike Romanian, I believe it's written in Cyrillic script as opposed to Latin script. So
A Romance language in a script derived from Greek. Very interesting.
how do you know?
What do you know?
Yeah.
So I think it's
So-
Iwan Kutalaba is how the name is pronounced. At least that seems to
that
be.
would make sense if it were derived from if it were derived from Ivan or
Oh,
something
that makes
close
sense.
to that.
Right, that's probably right. That's probably it. And not John, as we probably assumed.
Yeah. Well, what do you know?
Iwan Kutalaba. That is how they were saying it at the show. He fought one of my favorites to watch, who I hope doesn't get cut now that he's got 3 losses in a row, Enrique da Silva, a.k.a. Frankenstein, a.k.a. Frank Waston Jr., who always comes to fight and who did not get to do very much of it against Kutalaba, who just blasted him into oblivion in 22 seconds was the official time.
Yeah, the killer instinct that Kutalaba has is real stunning. I mean, his ability to jump on you when he's got you hurt it has always stood out. It's been actually, I think, the thing that has stood out most about his game since he was just running through guys on the European scene. It actually got him in trouble because that's how he had his first losses. He got DQ'd, I think, for illegal strikes as he had a guy hurt.
Yeah,
so
punches to the back of the head.
Yeah, so I think you get a sense for what kind of dude Kutalaba is. But, like, he is a real talent. He's really fast. He hits really hard. He moves well. He's a good athlete. He's got pretty well-rounded skill sets. He's a pretty good wrestler. He's pretty good from top position. And pushes a great pace too. Like it's going to decrease as he gets older, I think. But he's kind of a wild man right now. But like that dude can fight deep into the fight. He can fight into the third round. He ran a marathon a week after that like back and forth ridiculous fight he had with Jonathan Wilson, like where he took kind of a beating early. Like he ran a marathon a week after that.
Yeah,
that's ridiculous.
Yeah, he also, I mean, he got tired a bit at the end of his fight with Jared Cannonier, but that was one of the faster-paced light heavyweight fights we've ever seen. And you noted his killer instinct. I want to point out that some of that, I think, is because stylistically on the ground, he also has a bit of what Volkanovski brings to the table. He's also a very good ground and pound artist with, the sort of standing, postured up, let you move so I can hit you sort of style of ground and pound. And we know from watching Anderson Silva do that kind of stuff, that makes you a dangerous finisher when you are not just going crazy and smothering your work, but you are creating space and, when you have somebody hurt, you don't need to control them as strongly as you do. You know what I mean? Like, you don't need to keep your jab on somebody who is covered up, dazed against the ropes the same way you do someone who is aware in open space. And when somebody's on their back on the ground, because you knocked them down rather than because they pulled guard, you probably don't need to prioritize staying low and putting weight on them as much. And so Kutalaba, with his style of ground and pound, being postured up, being up high, creating distance for straight punches, it makes him a really dangerous finisher because that style is extremely precise and just aids guys with that killer instinct. So I think that's probably part of it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we're kind of seeing a renaissance of ground striking. Yeah. And we're going to be talking about that moving forward, I'm sure, more. When we actually get a break from the schedule at some point, maybe we'll do a full segment on it.
You and I were talking about that in relation to Zabit Magomed Shapirov.
Yeah, who should be debuting.
Sorry. My God,
Magomed Sharipov?
Magomed Sharipov. I'm terrible with his name.
Man, I mean, like, let's be real though. Like, in fairness to us, that is a difficult name. That is a very difficult name.
I think I'm pretty good with names like Nurmagomedov and stuff like that, but it's going to take me a little while to get Zabit Magomed Sharipov down. But he has the same kind of thing. A guy with a long frame, high posture, vicious, precise ground striking.
Yeah, true. So Dan Hooker versus Ross Pearson. Dan Hooker looked real good. Ross Pearson, I think, unfortunately, is kind of at the end of his tether. He's lost 4 in a row. He's lost, how many has he lost? He's lost 6 of his last 8 fights.
Yeah.
Jeez.
The thing is, it's not like Ross Pearson's been looking bad. He looks like a gatekeeper still. Like he had a close fight with Stevie Ray. He had a close fight with Will Brooks before that, and I thought he was doing pretty well in this fight. He may have won that first round. He was certainly, it was back and forth. So you could say that these are like the worst guys of his career, but not all of them. So I don't know. It's tough. He's had a bad run. I think he is definitely slowing down, and seeing him get knocked out now at 32, I think for the first time in quite a while. He was knocked out.
He got knocked out by Ali Quinta.
I was thinking it hadn't happened since the Cub Swanson fight, but he's had a couple.
Which was real knockout.
Yeah,
big time knockout.
One of the best. I don't know. I feel like he still looks okay as a gatekeeper type fighter. So I don't know really what to do with him or what I would like to see happen in his career at this point. If I'm willing to say that he's done. But Dan Hooker, certainly, we both agreed, despite having this, I think, be his first camp in a while away from Team Elevation, where he was training for quite some time. He's known as a guy who travels and tries to pick up as much as he can from different sources. He went back to a small team in New Zealand. It may be a considerable team, but I haven't seen any other fighters of theirs on the world stage. And put in what I think was probably the best, most controlled striking performance of his career. I think did what he needed to do with his frame and with his temperament. He allowed himself to be aggressive, which is what I think he's comfortable doing, but he did not go crazy. He used his reach. He used his height. Looked good.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a place for exciting, fun strikers. My thought after this fight is that Pearson's time filling that role is probably coming to an end, and somebody like Hooker's is probably coming to the fore.
Maybe it's a passing of the torch for the gatekeeper post.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, because Pearson, part of the problem is Pearson could fill that role for a long time because he was a demonstrably better striker than a lot of guys, right? Yeah. He was better at that than the guys that he was fighting, and that allowed him to keep his head above water. But Stevie Ray, I think, is a better striker than Ross Pearson is, a more dangerous striker. Dan Hooker can do more things, and he works at a quicker pace. Pearson's game is not deep enough or complete enough or adaptable enough to be in there in these fun striking matchups and win more than half of them.
Maybe what we're seeing with Ross Pearson is simply before our very eyes the metagame of MMA shifting.
I think that's probably it. I think that's probably a fair way of putting it.
I remember back when he fought Edson Barboza in 2011, and that was the greatest striking match I'd ever seen in MMA. It was intense, and it was a very high level. But Edson Barboza's game has changed and evolved a lot since then. And Ross Pearson's, I think, is still the same. I think it's as good as it was then. But we're seeing now, and maybe it's not just age. Maybe it's also the fact that he's also facing a lot of good strikers. Even people who aren't maybe as pretty technically, like guys like Francisco Trinaldo, he's facing people who are making their striking work for their style, who are really finding their comfort with striking in the MMA game in a way that wasn't very common back in 2011, when Ross Pearson seemed head and shoulders above most of the other kickboxers in the division.
You know what would be fun to do at some point?
Huh.
We should go back and pick out fights like Barboza-Pearson that point the direction toward the future metagame. And rewatch them in context, because one that always comes to mind for me is George St. Pierre versus Carl Parisian.
Okay,
that fight was like watching the future, and I think Barboza Pearson was absolutely like watching the future in terms of there were going to be a lot more matchups like Barboza Pearson moving forward, where guys who had previously been known as strikers, that level of skill has kind of become close to the norm for guys in that division.
Franklin Machida is a fight of that sort.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I mean, I think we could do a whole list of them.
That's a good idea. That's a good idea down the road. Before we do that, though, let's finish up here. What are your final thoughts on Mark Hunt versus Derek Lewis? We didn't. I think there was too much to be said about the tragic destruction of Daniel Kelly, so we will just let the man rest in peace.
Just bear in mind, elder abuse is a serious crime.
A man whom last week I described as Dan Henderson's picture of Dorian Gray.
Jesus Christ!
It really was.
That's good. That is really good.
It didn't feel good watching him get knocked out, is what I'm saying. He does look like an elderly man. So.
Oh my God! Jeez.
So let's talk about
that. Is. Mark Hunt looked real good, man. I thought that was the best Hunt has looked in a long time. I thought watching him against Alistair Overeem, I really thought that the end was nigh for Hunt, because he had so much trouble pulling the trigger. And in the Brock Lesnar fight too, Hunt had a ton of trouble pulling the trigger and getting his shots off. And I kind of thought if you're a puncher who can't pull the trigger on your punches anymore, like then I don't know how much longer you're going to be able to compete at that level. But I thought he fought Lewis really smart. I thought he let himself get Lewis's timing and distance. Lewis is not without craft, but his bag of tricks is not especially deep. And once Hunt saw the bottom of that bag of tricks, the fight was essentially over.
Yeah, Lewis actually surprised me with his craft. Like, I have not honestly seen much technical improvement, not a ton, out of Derek Lewis, even though we've been talking about him getting better. For me, most of that has been mental. It's just Derek Lewis learning what it feels like to not have a fight going his way and getting over it so that it makes him more effective, you know, and he can turn the fight better than anyone else in the division. He can turn the fight his way with a single moment. But, you know, like, his kicking form was pretty good in this fight. I thought it made a lot of sense for him to go for Hunt's head to try and keep his right hand at home, try to get him to duck into something with those left high kicks. Honestly, I thought his gas looked okay. The fight, like, he gassed out later really badly, but he threw a lot to keep Hunt off of him before then. So more than he does in most of his other fights. So I thought, you know, I was even impressed with that. But Mark Hunt, I'm going to disagree slightly. I kind of think it looked more or less like Mark Hunt has looked recently. I just think in this fight, the smart decision he made, and maybe had little trouble making, was not to throw too much. Was to sort of wait for Lewis to wear down, to keep him on the fence, to keep him on the end of his punches, and to really pick his shots. Because well after Hunt had obviously hurt Lewis, he banged him to the body, he had him tired. I think he stunned him with a left hook on the ear as Lewis was going for a knee. Even after that point, Hunt was still very calm and very patient. And I think it's just sort of a matchup thing maybe at this point, whether we look at Mark Hunt and say, is he tentative or is he patient? You know what I mean? They're kind of the same thing. It just depends on who you're fighting.
I don't think so. I'm going to disagree with you on that because I think that it was clear you could see the wheels turning in Hunt's head against Lewis when he was picking and choosing his shots. Like, there were times when he thought, okay, I can throw here, but I'm not going to. I think because I see that he's ready to throw a counter. And Lewis did a pretty good job of trying to time counter punches. Like, he got into a really nice rhythm with that in, I think, the second round.
Especially counter jabs. When has Lewis ever had a jab that good? It looked nice. Yeah.
Lewis did a good job of picking those shots off. So yes, there were points where you could see Hunt thinking like, okay, I don't want to throw this. And you could put yourself in his shoes and walk yourself through the process by which he was picking and choosing shots. That did not feel like the case to me against Overeem or against Lesnar. It felt to me like he was trying to throw, like he would walk himself right to the edge of throwing and then he just couldn't.
You don't think it's maybe this? It's maybe the same process where, I mean, to me, not being able to pull the trigger is hesitating, which maybe this is revealing more about me than it is about fighting as an art. But for me, that's usually a case of overthinking. If I'm hesitating, it's because I'm overthinking and can't decide on which of the many options have suddenly cropped up in my head. And to me, if I feel in control, that can be a good thing because I can very smartly pick my shots. But if I'm not in control in a sparring match or in a fight, then that same thought process can become a problem. And it's better at that point to just do and not think so much.
I see the distinction that you're trying to draw. I just don't think I'm just not quite buying it.
Okay,
like
that's fine.
To me, it really looked to me like there was something really wrong with Hunt and in the Overeem and Lesnar fights. And to me here, it did not look like there was something wrong. And I can't exactly define it, but it's like pornography. I know it when I see it, I guess. Because it was clear to me from the first minute of that Overeem fight, and I was there live for it.
Yeah.
It was clear to me that there was something not right about that. And it was clear to me in the first about minute and a half of the Lesnar fight that there was something not right about it. And I didn't get that feeling watching Hunt here. Like, he looked right from the get-go. Like, there's something about the way he was carrying himself. Or, like, I realize that's not technical analysis, but, like, I couldn't escape the feeling looking at him in this fight. Like, it looked like he was all there and not distracted in a way that he hadn't been.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. It was definitely a credible performance from him, and it is always nice to see late career Mark Hunt, when feasibly his stamina should be worse than ever, winning fights by outlasting people. Like, I really enjoy that. It tickles me.
Friend of the show, David Bixenspan, pointed out that Hunt went vegan a while back, And this was the first time where his cardio had really been tested since going vegan, and he passed that test with flying colors.
Oh, nice. All right. Well, congratulations to Mark Hunt. I had a terrible feeling I was going to see him get knocked out in this fight, and I'm really glad that I didn't. It was nice to see him do well. It's always, everybody loves the Super Samoan, so it's good to see him get another win. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to move on from UFC Auckland to UFC Singapore. Where are we in Singapore? UFC Kaiyang. I don't know.
Singapore is all, it's a city-state. We can just say Singapore. I think we're good.
We'll say Singapore. We'll call it UFC Fight Night Holm versus Correia, and we are going to get to our favorite fights from that after this. And then at the end of the show, stay tuned. We're going to be answering some questions from the heavy bag. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Let's talk about some of the fights from the main card, mostly, of UFC Singapore. Why don't we go ahead and just start with the main event. We'll talk about women's bantamweights, Holly Holm and Bethe Correia. Going to make this one fairly quick, Pat. It's a little hard these days to really get into the idea of a Holly Holm fight. And I think it's because, you got a drastic momentum that shift there from Holly Holm after, being the first woman to beat Ronda Rousey. Huge win, one of the biggest moments in MMA. 3 losses in a row is what she follows that with. And none of them particularly controversial. I know people complained about the Jermaine Durandamy fight, but I thought she very clearly was beaten at least 3 rounds to 2 in that one, despite all the fouling. I thought Valentina Shevchenko had her way with her, and she had a close but uneventful fight with Miesha Tate that ended, very eventfully in a submission loss for her. So there's no questions about that either. Holly Holm has just not been able to perform the way she did against Ronda Rousey. For me, I don't think it's so much a difference in Holly Holm. I think it is... I think it's style matchups, and I think now is the first time in her MMA career she has been facing style matchups that really don't favor her.
Yeah, she had a pretty hand-picked roster of opponents leading up to her fight with Ronda Rousey. And even so, despite having her opponents more or less picked out to emphasize her strengths, Holmes still did not look like a world beater, which is part of the reason why the line was so long against Rousey. We all saw the potential for Holm to do something like what she did. I think we all thought it would, if she could trouble Rousey, though it would probably be uglier and it would drag into the late rounds.
You and I thought she would force Rousey to take an ugly win rather than destroying her.
Yeah, I think that was not an uncommon thing beforehand. Nobody really expected Holm to knock Rousey's block off the way that she did. And so it was surprising. And I think in some ways what we've seen from Holm since then is more a reversion to the kind of fighter that we had good reason to think that she actually was.
Yeah, the Rousey fight that's the anomaly.
Outlier.
Yeah, that is the outlier. That's the one that doesn't. And it's because never has she and rarely will she again face an opponent who was so technically outmatched on the feet, so determined to close the distance, and that's basically it. Someone who did not learn any lessons from the first 4 or 5 really hard shots Holm landed as she ran into them, or someone who was not prepared to come up with answers to those questions. And most fighters are not going to be in these sort of weird training circumstances in which Ronda Rousey found herself. Most fighters are not even going to have the same bizarre, tangled, twisting complex of insecurities that seem to fuel Ronda Rousey's desire or lack thereof to fight. Most fighters are not the perfect style matchup for Holm to look like a killer striker, and we see that. 3 fights now. She's had 6 fights in the UFC. She's lost half of them, and she came fairly close to losing her first UFC fight as well to Rocky Pennington. I think we knew back then that this is more what to expect from her as an MMA fighter, unless she is facing totally outmatched competition.
And I don't think that she totally outmatches Bethe Correia.
No, I don't
think
either.
This is probably going to be a 5-round fight. I think it's probably going to go the distance. I think Correia is going to pressure her, which is going to give Holm opportunities to look her best self. But Correia is a pretty good counterpuncher, and if Holm does not get out of there right away, if Holm doesn't use every inch of her length, then Correia is going to hit her. And I think that's in large part what this fight is going to look like, with Correia trying to pressure, force Holm to throw, and then aggressively counter her. And I think Holm is going to, at the end of the day, end up on top because she's got a couple of inches of height and reach, because she's a better pure athlete, because she's bigger and more physical. I think that's going to give her the edge she needs to edge out like a 4-1 decision, like a 49-46 decision here.
Yeah. It's almost a sad reality that physicality is always like often what really fights between elite fighters really come down to. And I think that's the case here. I think Bethe definitely has the style to give Holly some problems, the counterpunching in particular. Holm's just not a great defensive fighter, especially when she's punching. She is there to be hit. She's a little too awkward, a little too committed to her strikes, somehow without really committing to them. You know what I mean?
She's just not hard to time or find.
Yes. Yeah.
On the counter at all. Like, de Randamie was not doing especially complicated things.
No.
Like she was skipping off to an angle and throwing like an inside angle counter right hand when Holm blitzed, and it worked every time she threw it.
Yep. Same with Shevchenko. Counter right hook, step off to that same side, counter right hook from a southpaw stance, landed almost every time. There's just a very clockwork nature about the way that Holly Holm has been trained to move and punch, and Correia will find opportunities off of that. But I think that Correia's going to want to pressure and come after Holm. I think she's going to give her some opportunities to land really actually hurtful shots by doing that. And I think it's going to be tough for her to keep up with the speed and the conditioning of Holly down the stretch.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think it should be clear from this, though, that like neither you nor I are engaged in the kind of like Bethe Correia hating that seems to be popular among a particular portion of MMA fandom. Like,
it's strange to me. It's like a weird sort of bullying thing, because it really is like people are committed to trashing Bethe Correia, even though, I don't know, like people were complaining about her fight with Marion Renault, which I thought was a really fun fight.
It was a good fight.
Yeah.
And she looked pretty good. She landed good shots. Like, she looked technical. I mean, part of it, like, I think the way that she talked her way into a title fight with Ronda Rousey still kind of rubs people the wrong way.
Well,
and because she got just flat out fucking clocked in that fight.
People don't hate Holly Holm, do they? We just talked, maybe she didn't talk her way into it, but we just looked. Marion Renault and Rocky Pennington, those are the two women she beat in the UFC to get a shot at Ronda Rousey.
Yeah, look, I'm not saying it has to make sense, but there's people missed the fact that after the Rousey fight, Correia has turned into a much better fighter than she was in the lead up to that. And like, I think it's been easy to miss the fact that Correia has actually turned into a pretty good fighter. She's still not a good athlete.
No. And
she's not especially physically gifted. But technically speaking, she's good, she's game, she's durable, she's mean. And that goes a long way in a really thin division.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, she's very game. She's had close fights. I know they're not all barn burners, but I have enjoyed all of her last three. I thought her fight with Rocky Pennington, who's also a fighter that I quite enjoy watching. Scrappy, close, hard fought. The fight with Jessica Ai, similar. And then the fight with Marion Renault was genuinely very good, where we got to see Correia survive some really tough spots in the third round as well. So I think Correia doesn't get the respect she deserves. I agree. And I think she will be a test for Holly Holm. It would not shock me if Bethe Correia won here. And I think a lot of people, because of their personal feelings for one or both of these fighters, would be really surprised if Correia even did well here. And I do expect her to have some moments, at the very least.
Yeah, I just don't think there will be enough of them. But kind of moving down the rest of the card, no real reason to talk about Arlovsky Tybura, but Dong Hyun Kim versus Colby Covington. That's a good-ass fight, man. That's a good-ass welterweight fight.
Yeah. What's your read on it?
I think a lot of it has to do with where Kim is at in his career. Mm-hmm. He's I think now 34. He's been fighting for 13 years as a professional. He's been around for a long time.
35. Turned 35 in November.
Oh, wow. So 35-year-old Dong Hyun Kim, whereas Covington is very clearly the fighter on his way up. He's in his physical prime. He's got that deep wrestling background. His striking is starting to look much better. He's looking real good on the counter, throwing a nice right jab. And I think that's going to be enough for Covington to take this. Like, for a long time, Kim's takedown defense was good enough to stuff basically everybody. But when you look back at that, that was kind of inflated. That was kind of an inflated run that he had. And basically every good takedown artist who's ever tried to take him down has succeeded. And Covington is a really good takedown artist. Plus, Covington blends the threat of his strikes and his takedowns in a way that will probably trouble Kim. Covington is still figuring out the striking game, and he's not super polished, but I think he's more than good enough and physical enough and athletic enough and powerful enough to really cause some problems. I think he's going to win the fight. I don't know if he'll finish Kim, but I think he'll win this pretty handily.
Yeah, and I think stamina might be an edge for him as well. Kim is not exactly like reliably badly conditioned, but we have definitely seen him in fights where he has to put a ton of effort into everything he's doing, where he wears down pretty quickly. And Covington always puts a ton of effort in just by nature of his style and never seems to wear down. So I think that's got to be an edge for him.
Yeah, Covington has that Division I wrestler type of stamina.
Yeah.
Like he hit 12 takedowns against Bryan Barberena.
Yeah.
And was officially credited with 12 takedowns. And that was a grueling, grinding, nasty inside fight, and Covington looked fresh at the end of it. I think that's going to be a big edge for him moving forward. He's another one of these guys who doesn't necessarily have to get you down. He's willing to let you move under him. He'll posture. Pretty vicious ground striker when he puts his mind to it. Like, I like Covington's game a lot.
I think it's with him, it's all about, because he's a great back taker as well when he gets the chance. And I think with Covington, it seems to all be about, sort of like we talk about pressure fighting, and you can, if somebody's going to escape, if you can't move as quickly as them and cut them off, then you can at least punish them for escaping. And with Covington, I think it's all about allowing you to stand up in the way that he wants you to. Like, if you're going to stand up anyway, if you're going to work, then it better be in such a way that he can immediately dump you onto your head again. And so that's what he does. He will always it always seems like he's sort of walking his opponents into another single leg takedown or into a waist cinch as they get up, or he's forcing them to give up their back in order to escape. They only get to move in ways that allows him to maintain control over the exchange.
Yeah, it's a really smart kind of game that he's built for himself. I like the way that he's been built. He's an ATT guy. I think they have developed him really intelligently. He's got all the physical tools. He's actually been in the UFC now for almost 3 years. Like, this is his time to make a run. He's 5 years into his pro career. He's in his late 20s at this point. Like, now's the time. I think he's got all that he needs to do it, and I would expect him to be a top 10 fighter sooner rather than later here. Yeah,
and you know what? His run has looked at the way we would expect from a genuine prospect. Like, early win made us realize he was the real deal when he beat Mike Pyle in his first big test. And then he had what was a certified prospect loss to Warlley Alves. Got very quickly submitted by just being a little too committed to his game, or just, got unlucky. That happens to prospects all the time. We talk about that all the time. He gets back on the winning track, and now that win over Bryan Barberena, that carries a lot of weight to me. I think we've seen from Barberena that he is pretty legit and definitely a tough dude to consistently beat over 3 rounds. And Covington had no problems with him whatsoever. So he is definitely a genuine prospect, I think, although, maybe a little old. 29, but certainly a guy who I think could very well be on the verge of contention, especially if he beats, the stun gun here. Finally, let's talk about this welterweight fight, and that is an interesting wrinkle because taking part in it is former lightweight champion Rafael dos Anjos. He lost his belt to Eddie Alvarez, then lost a fun but clear decision to Tony Ferguson, and decided that the lightweight cut was just too much. I don't think that's a particularly big surprise to either of us because we talked for a long time about what a massive and heavily muscled lightweight he was. I'm curious to see how he will do moving up to welterweight, especially taking on, sort of a shop-worn but very crafty technical striker in Tarek Saffiedine.
It's a really interesting first fight for him at welterweight. It's not like he's not facing one of the monsters of the division, but he is facing a guy who can trouble him stylistically.
Yeah.
So I think that's the real twist here is what is RDA going to do against a pretty good-sized welterweight who has the kind of skill set that could really give him problems for over a 3-round fight. Like it's easy to see a scenario in which Saffiedine kind of jibs and jabs his way to a 29-28 decision here.
Yeah, can Saffiedine kind of steal big shots and control the way that, like a less violent version, I expect, of what Andy Alvarez did? Or is he going to go down the way Anthony Pettis did? Like, we have helpful parallels to know what two kinds of fights we can probably get out of Rafael dos Anjos here. How do you think, first of all, him moving up to welterweight, do you have any feelings about that for him?
I think it's exactly the right move because he's a big guy, man. Yeah. Like, he is a really big lightweight.
He's not super tall, but he's thick. He's built like a tank.
Yeah, like so I've met RDA, and RDA is not a small guy. Like he looks like welterweights do.
Yeah.
He is a sizable man. And like I would guess, I saw him the week after he knocked out Donald Cerrone in his first title defense. And I would say conservatively he was 190 a week after.
Wow.
Conservatively. Like he was a big dude. So I think this is the right move for him, especially if he wants to continue fighting for a while longer. Mm-hmm. Making that cut over and over and over again, he had reached the point of diminishing returns. Mm-hmm. And he's got enough craft and enough depth to his game that I think he's a good candidate to move up and be pretty good.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. As for Tarek Saffiedine, like he has definitely struggled to find his footing in the UFC. A lot of that's because he's been competing really inconsistently because of injuries. And it definitely seems like he's losing a step from where he formerly was. Although you could also argue, he's fighting very good competition. Rick Story, Dong Hyun Kim, Rory McDonald, those are the guys to beat him in the UFC. He's still performing, I think, admirably. Even if maybe his chin looks kind of shaky, if he seems to maybe wear out a little too easily these days, maybe the injuries have something to do with that. He's still performing well. He still goes... The fight with Dong Hyun Kim was close. He had a good performance in that fight, I thought. He looked very good and in control when he fought Jake Ellenberger, even if he got rattled once or twice. And he hung in there with Rick Story as well, and that was a really good showing from Rick Story. What do you think he has to offer RDA stylistically?
Well, so he's going to have to try and stick and move if RDA comes after him. But I think... while it was not enough for him to beat Tony Ferguson, I really liked some of the evolution that RDA showed in his last fight. Mm-hmm. I thought that his counterpunching looked even better than it has in the past. I thought he did a much better job of moving in open space than he has. Because prior to that, the RDA that we had talked about was one who really needed the fence to win fights. Like he was competitive in open space. It's not like he was helpless there, but that was not where he made his money. He made his money when he could back you up and get you going there, and he could work takedowns and he could work his combination game and generally force the pace and force the kind of fight that he wanted.
Right.
Now, the fact that it didn't work against Ferguson, who is just a quicker paced, longer, craftier, deeper at a kind of a craftier, deeper kind of game to bring to bear, does not mean that that's not going to serve him well against Tarek Saffiedine, who is not Tony Ferguson.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, in that fight, we saw that. I think that fight sort of cemented in my mind the notion that Dos Anjos is best when he can pressure, and when he can't pressure, he is not. You won't see his A game. You won't see what he's really capable of. But we also saw, I think, some of the best non-pressure fighting that we've seen from him. It's just that he was fighting, one of the very best guys in the world right now in Tony Ferguson.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point that you raised there, Connor, because, pressuring is always going to be his A game, I think. But the question is going to be, can he win fights with his B game? And to me, that showed me that, yes, against guys who are not Tony Ferguson, he could win fights with his B game.
Or ideally, can his B game be good enough that it can force people back into his A game? We'll allow him to buy time if he needs to rest or land a good shot, or just sort of convince the person that they need to back off and reconsider, at which point he can go back to doing what he really does best.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, Connor. I mean, and so I think that's going to be enough for RDA to get this. I expect him to win 29-28 or 30-27 decision here. Mostly because with Saffiedine, as crisp as he's looked and as skillful as he is in so many different things, he just has no ability to hurt you or finish you.
Yeah. I was going to say the same thing. Moving up, RDA still seems like the much more dangerous striker in this matchup.
Unquestionably.
Yeah.
And normally to really put a stamp on things, RDA needs to get a takedown and some top control. but I don't think he needs to against Saffiedine. I think he can outwork him. I think he hits way harder, even moving up a weight class. Like, because what this means strategically is that Saffiedine basically always has to be perfect.
Mm-hmm.
He has very little margin for error in the way that he fights. Yeah. And sometimes that works out really well for him. Like against Nate Marquardt, Saffiedine was perfect.
Oh, yeah.
He did not make a single mistake in that fight. But against Ellenberger, he made some mistakes. He made a couple of mistakes against Dong Yoon Kim. He made a couple of mistakes against Rick Story. And that's enough. Like, when you're fighting at this level against guys that are this skilled in a division this deep, you don't have room to make those kinds of mistakes.
Yeah, and I think a big reason for when we see a perfect fight from Saffiedine and when we don't are when the pressure is put on him. You know, when somebody like Nate Marquardt, not nobody's idea of a great, consistent pressure fighter. He can do it in bursts, but that's what Saffiedine wants, is a fighter who can, in bursts, come forward. He can do a quick evasion, a nice pivot, and hit them back. His counterpunching, his jab, his low kicks, his footwork, all of those things really are sublime. He's a very, very good technician. But when the pressure's on, that technique starts to fall apart a bit. He starts to cover up more, starts to step straight back, and doesn't throw back as much, which is a big problem. He does not make you pay for getting after him. And so, to see somebody in RDA who I think is just going to slowly build the pressure as the fight goes on, I agree. I think he should be favored to win this one.
Yeah, totally agree. Good. I mean, surprisingly good card. I'm not going to wake up super early in the morning to watch this, but I will watch it later and enjoy it. Yeah,
there are definitely some highlights throughout the card as well. I mean, there are some ones that really make you groan. Like, I have no interest in seeing Takanori Gomi versus John Tuck, for example. It makes me sad to think of it. But we have two undefeated flyweights debuting in Naoki Inoue and CJ De Tomas, two very good fighters.
This was crazy. Watching that CJ De Tomas guy, the announcers in his last fight mentioned this. His father had lost a fight to the guy that he was fighting.
What?
He was trying to avenge one of his father's losses.
That is amazing.
And I looked at this, and that motherfucker was born in 1996. Like, I'm getting too old for this shit, man.
That's amazing.
I refuse to be watching a sport where a guy can be trying to avenge one of his father's losses. This is ridiculous. Like, what is happening to MMA?
That is everything I've ever wanted from this sport. Are people avenging? I want more dojo wars. I want more sort of just blood pacts to get revenge on people. I love that.
Okay, so I dig that dynamic, but it makes me feel so old to realize that this dude, this young ass dude, is old enough to be fighting to avenge one of his father's losses. Like, that shit. Oh, God, it just makes me feel my own mortality, man.
Bantamweight division is very strong, and this bantamweight fight between Kwan Ho Kwok and Russell Doan, I think, is going to be fireworks. I think that is sneakily a very good action matchup. And then one of my favorites, the Leech, Li Jingliang, is back, and he's fighting another CJ De Tomas as a URCC, as a Filipino promotion, and he's a champion there. And so is Frank Camacho, the guy who's debuting to fight Li Jingliang. Not a world beater, but a guaranteed action fighter. And if he's fighting the Leech with that style, I think that one will also be extremely entertaining. So like the first 4 or 5 fights on the prelims and then the last 4 fights on the card are all worth watching, I'd say.
Yeah, Justin Scoggins versus Ulka Sasaki. Probably going to be real fun, too.
Yeah, especially because Ulka Sasaki looked really good against Wilson Hayes. Like, totally new developments for him as a striker. And, the swagger, the Diaz-esque swagger he brought to the cage. I hope to see more of that against Scoggins. Let's take one more break. When we come back, as promised, we are going to answer some questions from our patrons after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And now, as promised, let's get into some of those questions from our patrons. Ooh, been a while since we've heard that sound effect. And I forgot to preface it by saying that it was going to... I'm so sorry if I surprised or shocked anyone out there. I know we've had a problem with that in the past. I want our listeners to be very calm. I want this to be a therapeutic experience, so please accept my deepest apologies for surprising you with that nasty noise. Our first question comes to us from Robert, one of our Patreon subscribers. Robert says... What are the worst views held by casual and or hardcore MMA fans? But you have to explain, here's the preface or the requirement for this, Pat. You have to explain why that viewpoint is so bad. Preferably one casual viewpoint and one hardcore viewpoint. All right. What do we got?
Okay, so I'm not sure whether this falls into a casual or hardcore viewpoint, but this tendency drives me nuts. When somebody says his striking is better or his wrestling is better, that absolutely drives me nuts because striking is not a monolith. Wrestling is not a monolith. Grappling is not a monolith.
Yeah.
There are a lot of different things that go into that. There are a lot of different styles within those styles, and that's part of the reason why I'm glad that we have done the kinds of styles make fights things that we've done over the years, because they're broader archetypes that serve to encompass some nuances in that. Because, like, we're talking about striking. You can be a better technical striker and lose a fight to a worse striker who happens to be a stylistic kryptonite to you.
Yeah,
so,
and
like,
does that, and then what do you even mean by better or worse? Like, if we're talking just about fundamental technique, then you can make that assessment with some reasonable degree of certainty. But even then, does that make someone a better striker or a better grappler to have better fundamental technique? Maybe not. Maybe they're
absolutely not.
Maybe they're a lot stronger. Maybe they have much better stamina. Maybe they're just a mean bastard. Maybe the other guy is sort of insecure or a little cautious, or maybe he's, just maybe he's too patient for his own good. There are many, many things that can go into just having good or not so good fundamental technique that can really affect how that affects your game.
Yeah, it's that. So I guess if I had to boil it down, it would be that tendency to use a simple value judgment adjective like good, bad, better, things like that. That drives me absolutely nuts.
Sure.
Because it doesn't actually tell us very much. Like you pointed out something key there, and that's what is your standard of comparison? Is it effectiveness? Is it aesthetics? Is it fundamental soundness?
Yeah.
Which pieces of fundamental soundness do you think are most important?
Yeah, even the most nitty-gritty, precise thing like fundamental technique, that also is not cut and dry. There are some people who say this is the proper way to throw a jab and this is the proper way. This is the proper way to pivot. I mean, I know what my beliefs are for most of those things, but far be it for me to come up against like somebody like Rafael Cordero who disagrees and say that he's wrong. You know what I mean? So... even then, even if you're just comparing fundamental soundness, it is not necessarily a good comparison. I think it can be a good place to start for when the style matchup is really between two very different fighters. Like, obviously, if Damian Maia is fighting Jorge Masvidal, we're going to say, yeah, Masvidal's a better striker. If it's in the striking, he's going to have the control in that aspect. But we have to then also talk about how Maia's striking is designed to create the kind of exchanges he wants for grappling. And does that mean that the fact that Masvidal's better striking is not going to be such a big advantage? Probably. So it's just more complicated than that. I think that's sort of the theme of our show is that fighting is complicated, and better, worse, good, bad, it doesn't usually tend to describe it with such broad envelopes of material there. As for me, I'm going to bring up something that this is probably something hardcore fans say, and I've obviously complained about this many times before, but the idea that moving around a lot equals good footwork has always bugged me. And it does really irk me when somebody will see somebody that they've never seen fight before, and he's just jumping all over the place. He's constantly bouncing. His feet are never still. And yet, even though every time he gets pressed, he retreats in a straight line, and every time he comes forward, he loses his stance, and every time he makes a rare sidestep, he's off balance and can't counter off of it, people will say that because he's moving a lot, he's got good footwork. And I think, honestly, I hate to say it, I think Muhammad Ali is to blame for this. I think Muhammad Ali and, Bruce Lee, you know what I mean? This generation of people that grew up seeing flashy footwork and thinking that that's what footwork was.
Well, There's a basic issue there, and that's that Muhammad Ali could do what he did with his footwork in terms of breaking rules to do things that looked flashy because he understood what the purpose was, and he understood how fundamental footwork was supposed to work, and that gave him freedom to then play with those rules and break them as necessary. Like, you can't, but there's a difference between that and doing what Alexander Gustafsson does, to name one example, and something that we've talked about a fair bit. Like, where it's just never correct to turn your back and run. Like, it's not right. Not because it's not effective, but because it exposes you to more danger than you need to be putting yourself in. Yeah. While there are still other ways of doing that do not put you in that kind of danger.
But Gustafsson still is a fighter who's talked about as having very good footwork, and it does tend to get to you over time. Like, it doesn't matter that much, but this is like the borderline autistic way that people like Pat and I think about fighting, that it's like this intense fixation. You just can't get over all these little quibbles when you hear enough of them.
So, I mean, really and truly, I don't think that either you or I really think a lot in terms of something being objectively correct or not correct in terms of fighting. I think we view the sport with a lot of nuance.
I used to when I first got started, but over time, I don't think you can spend as much time as we do studying like fighters and come away from it thinking that there's one way to do anything.
Yeah, and so, but I think footwork is one of those things where it's kind of an exception. Where there are ways of moving your feet in a high-pressure environment that are objectively correct and not correct. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the few things that we hold on to is like, Jesus Christ, that's just wrong. It's just wrong. You know? So, But I'll be honest with you. I don't think that either you or I could really point to casual things that get that.
There's one. There's one that is
okay. Point it out to me, because I don't think we spend enough time talking to casuals to know.
It's not and this does also permeate some levels of the hardcore fan base, but I would just to dismissively describe this as filthy casual behavior. Is the sort of notion, this is endemic to combat sports in general, that when somebody loses, they're trash. And this is not something you hear from fans in other sports. Like, you certainly have really intense rivalries, and people will definitely tell each other that their teams suck, but nobody who is trying to talk analytically or who's trying to make a value judgment about a team would say, oh yeah, but remember when the Steelers lost to the Pats 3 years ago, they suck. Don't you remember that loss? They'll never beat them, and so on and so forth. And I think it's because fighting is so much more individual, right? The Steelers team could change drastically over the course of that 2 or 3 years. And even when they lose, it's a lot harder to pin the loss or to attribute a win to just one or two members of the team. Whereas for a fighter, they accept most of the guilt for losing or for not looking good. And it's just this really negative idea that we can't... I think that's part of the appeal of fighting, is that it's so personal and individual. You get to see one person fighting one other person, and you really get to, I think, learn a lot more about them over the course of that conflict than you would in any other kind of game. That a fight, to me, is not a game. It tells you something a little more. But we should still be able to view it as a sport and know that, yeah, you win and you lose, and that shouldn't affect how people view you permanently. Because everybody loses. And if you're not losing, you're either the greatest of all time or you are not fighting the best competition possible. And it's usually the latter.
Yeah, and I'll say this, even for the more hardcores who may dig into that particular brand of god-awfulness, like, don't let the result overpower the process that goes into it, right? Like, you can win a fight and have it be bad in the grand scheme of things. You can lose a fight and have it be good in the grand scheme of things. Like, I'll give you an example of this. Like, Luke Sanders lost to Yuri Alcantara. The outcome was bad. The process up until the moment he got knee barred was fantastic. Mm-hmm. You look at that fight does not, the fact that he lost that fight does not make me think about him and say, like, yeah, okay, his career is going down the shitter. Mm-hmm. Whereas you can have a guy win a fight and think that does not bode especially well for him moving forward. Like, I'm struggling to think of one off the top of my head.
But and even then, it's not always going to tell you as much as you want it to tell you. Sometimes people have a bad night, or sometimes it's just a terrible style matchup, or the other guy's having a fantastic night and he's feeling more fired up than ever before. sometimes somebody looks like dog shit in a loss, and then they come back 3 months later and they look in the best form of their career. You know, you never know. And if you jump to too many judgments, there may in fact be a logical explanation that you're not seeing. Like, for example, I said a lot of quite critical things about the performances of Jim Miller recently, but I think I feel pretty safe now saying that a lot of what we saw from him that was not ideal can be attributed to the fact that he was really struggling with Lyme disease. And that now that he seems to be mostly over it, he looks great. He looks better than ever. So you just never know.
Yeah, like, it's hard to... I think you hit on something really important there, and that's that there's a lot of information that we are just not privy to.
Yeah.
Even people who pay a lot of attention, who are watching interviews, who are watching the tape, who are writing about it, who are talking to coaches, and like, no matter how much information you have available, there's still going to be a lot of things that you just don't know about.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, yeah, I mean, like, there was a female fighter in Brazil who competed while pregnant. Like,
oh.
That's like the kind of thing that there's no way that you're going to know that.
Did she
beforehand.
know? Did she know she was pregnant?
I cannot remember, and I don't particularly want to go digging back down that rabbit hole.
I sure hope she didn't. Jesus.
It's shit like that. Or Joanne Calderwood, before she fought Marina Moroz, like having broken up with her long-term boyfriend in like a fairly crushing turn of events.
Sure. Or Mark Hominick, when he got quickly knocked out by Chan Sung Jung. I think his brother had just died. Like, you never know. There's things that go on that affect fighters. It comes back.
Jake Shields, before he fought Jake Ellenberger, his dad had just died. Right.
Yeah. It comes back to what we were saying before, the theme of the show. It's complicated. You can't come up with such a simple answer that this guy sucks or this guy's great necessarily based on one night. It just doesn't tell you enough. And that's why we don't have everybody fight each other one time and no more. We have rematches. We have long careers for a reason. Because it's a sport, you have to see performances over time and in a wide variety of contexts against a wide variety of opponents to really know what a fighter is about. Okay, Let's move on to another question here. I couldn't remember if we played the sound effect for each one or not. Apparently we do now. This one comes to us from Angelo C. And Angelo asks, quite an in-depth question here. With opponent-specific game planning already a significant factor affecting the outcomes of fights, how do you think about training the metagame? Or the training metagame, rather. While fight-specific game plans and adjustments change from camp to camp, training areas of focus are so varied, the arc of improvement can span multiple fights in multiple years. So in your opinion, is there an optimal strategy to structure training to produce improvements in key areas to give a fighter the best chance to win? Does it depend on the fighter or the division, the current champion, or the top contenders? So the core question here is, sorry, it's a lot there. Is there an optimal strategy to structure training to produce improvements?
So I think it depends on the fighter and it depends on the stage of their careers, right? Like, I think young fighters probably benefit more from lots of group classes and group work and probably benefit from sparring more and don't need quite as much individualized attention. I think once you hit the elite levels of the sport, especially if you're a much more experienced fighter, you're going to need more personal instruction and more opponent-specific training because you're no longer, like Firas Zahabi talked about this the first time I interviewed him. Like, he has a basic curriculum that everybody needs to learn in order to be able to do the other stuff. Like, you need to know how and when to go from, a three-punch combination to a double leg. You need to know how to use evasive footwork. You need to know how to pivot. You need to know how to throw a few different variations on the jab. These are things that everybody needs to know. You need to know how to roll into a leg lock. Like, you need to know how to use a leg lock to escape. Things like this are like the basic pieces of your game. Once you've mastered the basic pieces, then I think you have a lot more room to do the kind of opponent-specific stuff. Like, I'll give you an example of this. Like, Sage Northcutt is a guy who's always been trained by, in a kind of a limited environment by his dad and by a couple other people like that. That's not what Sage Northcutt needs. That might benefit a fighter who's much further down the road, who really needs to work on specific things, who needs a lot of personalized instruction.
Right.
Sage Northcutt would benefit more from just going and being a guy in a room surrounded by a bunch of other professional fighters.
Sure. Yeah, I'm with you. I think people don't realize, too, that in the gyms where people train, like when they come up, even before you make the decision to go pro or to go to take a real fight as an amateur even, there are sort of levels where you're sort of repeating a certain process until you get to a certain point. And like oftentimes in the gym for a young fighter, the gym sparring matches are very much like a mini career, where you will sort of learn who you are. As you're learning technique, you're also sparring certain guys. And your coach will have an eye on a certain guy that he'll use to test you to see if you're really ready for a real fight. And if you fight that guy, you spar that guy, you don't do well, your coach will often have another guy ready to prepare you to spar that guy better the next time. And so you'll have these little like rubber matches and series in the gyms where people are preparing. And to me, that is all about building experience, building comfort, all while just doing sort of blanket drills in the meantime to work on everything that you do. And that is what you get from, like having a dedicated coach, but being in a gym, or at least if you're in a small team, having a lot of connections to other gyms where you are around other people all the time. Later on, I think with veterans, with people who are experienced, almost all of the drilling in a camp can often be built around what the opponent brings to the table. Like I was thinking about this while watching the latest season of The Ultimate Fighter. I watched the last episode, and T.J. Dillashaw, spoilers for anybody who hasn't seen it, T.J. Dillashaw was training Joe Daddy Stevenson, and they wanted him to pressure. It didn't go his way. He got knocked out very quickly. But the game plan was they wanted him to pressure, they wanted him to move his head to get in, and they wanted him to force his opponent against the fence where he could clinch up and score takedowns. That was the essential game plan. And, there's editing going on, but based on what they showed, it seemed like pretty much all the training they did was based around, like all the drills they selected were specifically, they weren't to sharpen up technique in general, they were to sharpen up the game plan. They weren't training the fighter so much as they were training the game plan. And so it was like all slip lines, it was partner drills on the slip lines, it was pushing Dillashaw back as the training partner, taking him down, and then hopping back up and getting right back onto the slip line. Just sort of training for what the flow of the fight would be like. I think that benefits somebody like Joe Stevenson, who's been fighting forever, in a way that it wouldn't necessarily, where fighter-specific training isn't necessarily as important as it is for a younger fighter. And I think that's kind of why we see the prospect loss so often, where somebody would just get caught by a really crafty opportunist. I think that's sort of a marker that you've reached the point where you need to stop just figuring yourself out and start training for your opponents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for that. And that's why after guys hit that loss, how they respond next is really important, and how they respond kind of structurally with their training. Like, that's why to me it's really promising that Bektic left ATT for a while and traveled around to Colorado to work with Dwayne Ludwig. He went up to TriStar to work with Firas Zahabi. He went a couple other places. Like, he kind of got out of his comfort zone and was like, okay, let's try some other things and see what we can figure out. And I think that that's a thing that a lot of guys do after they hit this point in their career. They got to figure out what works best for them and what's not working for them. And so Dustin Poirier making the decision to cut way back on his sparring. You just don't need to do things like that anymore. And it's part of a process of growth. And like, I don't think either you or I are like martial arts fetishists, but these guys are still martial artists, you know, and there's an element of art and self-knowledge and self-discovery that goes along with this. And I think the guys who embrace that and understand that, that tends to play into the way that they focus their training for specific things.
Yeah, I'm with you. Okay, one more question. We will try to get to this one relatively quickly. This one's from Miguel Class, another one of our patrons. Miguel asks, volume, rhythm, strike diversity, adaptability, efficiency of movement, and being process-driven. These are a few of the attributes that you guys have consistently stressed as important for success at the top of modern MMA. However, what about the fighters that don't seem to value many of these attributes yet still find success? Fighters like Tyron Woodley and Yoel Romero, to an extent, that seem to break the mold. Would they be better if they fought more like Max Holloway, who is his example of someone who seems to fit everything we talk about, which is, of course, why we've been such a big fan of him for so long? Or are their styles in some way perfectly suited for their talents?
So that's a really, really good question.
Yeah.
And I think there's an extent to which, I'm going to bust this term out again, we are fetishists for those things.
Yeah.
I think because we watch a lot of fights, right? We are less focused on any individual than we are on the broad outlines of what's happening at a kind of a deep and broad level in the sport of mixed martial arts. Now, that doesn't mean that that the fact that those things seem to be what produces the greatest number of wins works for everybody in exactly the same way. Like, you can be right about something in broad outlines and be incredibly wrong in the particulars. Like, I don't think John Dodson would really benefit from going out there and trying to throw 15 to 20 strikes a minute. I don't think that would really make him that much better a fighter.
Yeah.
I don't think it would make Yoel Romero a better fighter if he went out and was like, okay, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, and just spammed jab cross combinations.
Can you imagine Yoel Romero going out and like working the jab, like hitting triple jabs and like feinting it, throwing it to the body? Doesn't seem like his thing, really.
Yeah, I'm not sure that would make him a better fighter. I'm not sure that would make Tyron Woodley a better fighter either, for that matter. I think that there's always going to be an extent to which guys have to find their own games and have to find what works for them. I would say, as far as Woodley and Romero are concerned, though, both are pretty adaptable. Both set pretty good rhythms, and both are process driven, just not in a way that involves throwing a ton of strikes.
Yeah.
Like, I think we need like, the most common way to fit all those things is to throw a pretty substantial volume of strikes, but that's not the only way to set up your game effectively.
Yeah. And I would say to that point, this certainly gets to the idea of style being a heavy determiner of how somebody fights. That does it make more sense for you to fight to a certain set game plan, or does it make sense for you to fight to your style, to what not just you necessarily, because you might have some things you need to overcome, but maybe what your coach decides is the best way for you to fight, what you are most comfortable doing according to the people who know you maybe better than you are willing to know yourself. And I think that I would usually come down on the side of style. That I've always been somebody who says that if a tall fighter is not comfortable fighting from long range and wants to get inside and press forward, then it doesn't really make sense to try to make that guy just an uncomfortable outfighter because his body says you should. If his personality wants to be an infighter, that's probably what he's going to be best at doing. Unless there is some real like mental hang up going into that preference. But I will also say that most of the various styles you see, and Pat kind of got into this, saying about, Woodley and Romero having some of these attributes just in different ways, are that these things that we talk about all the time are, some of them are not necessarily a specific way you have to fight, like a specific tactic, so much as they are categories of tactics. And they're still going to be fulfilled by most effective, successful fighters. So if you have somebody like, I'm going to talk about a boxer, because this is the example that always jumps to my mind. You have somebody like Mike McCallum, the body snatcher. If you haven't watched his fights, go watch his fights, because he's amazing. Mike McCallum, not really a volume puncher, but Mike McCallum looked like a volume puncher when he needed to, because he had a really great pawing jab, and he would kind of stick his hands out there and keep you busy. He wanted to counterpunch, but he would sort of fulfill the role that volume had to play by feinting and by extending his hands without trying to do damage. Efficiency of movement, I would say, would help everybody, but do you want to train a fighter? I mean, the reason we want efficiency of movement is to make the most out of a fighter for as long as possible. If you have somebody who can cover distance really quickly by leaving his stance and hits really hard, and he can do that in bursts for 5 rounds, then, does it make sense to tell him, no, this is the efficient, correct way to move if it's going to hurt that? Not necessarily. You want people to be able to know the rules so they can break them. And I would say that most effective fighters do fulfill some aspect of all of those categorical things that you listed, Miguel, like volume, rhythm, strike diversity, adaptability, efficient movement, and process. Most successful fighters have some version of all of those things.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely the case. It's very rare. I would say with an effective fighter, it's more likely that we haven't figured out how those categories apply to them than that they don't do any of those things effectively.
Yeah, it's more about how are you fulfilling the goal of those things we've listed. You don't have to be a high volume fighter, but you're probably going to have to come up with some way to accomplish what volume accomplishes. So maybe you're very accurate, maybe you have great timing, or maybe, like most people, you have to kind of throw fake volume to create openings for the punches you really want to throw. But you're still going to have to do what volume does for people, which is give them opportunities and let them control the momentum. Like you're still going to need that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. And I appreciate your questions, guys. Miguel, Angelo, Robert, thank you guys for supporting us, of course, as always. And thank you so much for writing in. We hope we gave you some satisfactory answers to those questions. Before we wrap up here, Pat, what do you have coming out this week?
Man, not that much. I think I'm writing a thing for Deadspin on the whole Demetrius Johnson versus the UFC situation, because it really pissed me off the way that they were talking about Demetrius Johnson, and I think that there's a whole lot of fallacies in there. Starting with the idea that the lighter weight fighters and Mighty Mouse in particular, quote unquote, don't sell. I think that's a whole lot of bullshit because. And I asked the UFC, and we'll see if they respond, to point to an event that Demetrius Johnson has headlined as champion that didn't make money, that they were running in the red. So we'll see if they answer that. My sense is that they probably won't. But I don't know. That whole thing really pissed me off. So I'm going to write a thing about that.
All right.
Then I've got a new episode of Fall of Rome coming out this week, an interview with the fantastic Liz Brunig of the Washington Post. We're going to talk about St. Augustine and the rise of Christianity and how Augustine, one of the all-time great theologians and just thinkers in general, how he has stuck with us to this day.
We've heard about this interview about 3 times on this show now, Pat, and I got to tell you, it better live up to expectations. All right,
she's awesome. She's really, really, really fucking smart. And St. Augustine is fascinating, so I think you'd better listen, is what I'm saying.
Just don't bullshit me, okay? You've set a very high bar for what this episode's going to be. I'm very excited. It better be good. That's all I'm saying.
Maybe I'm just good at interviewing, and all my interviews are good, Connor.
Ooh, very sassy here at the end of this episode of Heavy Hands. As for me, is that everything from you?
Yeah, I think that's about all I'm doing this week.
I mean, you can say more. I don't want to make you feel like you can't name, what else is going on.
I really don't think I'm doing anything else this week. Okay. I've got lots of stuff that's coming in the future. I'm doing lots of work for things that are not, immediate.
Okay. For my part, I have a Sherdog preview coming out this week, as usual, on the Singapore card. Again, a card that does not stand out when you first look at it, but I think if you read my preview, you'll probably see that there are actually quite a few fights that are intriguing and stand to be very entertaining. I think it'll be a little bit like last weekend's card, where it's just a little layer of dust on top of the gold in some of these matchups. I'm still working on an Aldo piece. I have a sort of mixture of technical analysis and more prosy sort of philosophical writing about the role of a champion. That's taken me longer than I expected, but I am trying to put that out this week. If the casual MMA world has not already forgotten that Jose Aldo ever lived or existed, going back to what we were saying before. And I think that's about it for me, at least all that I know. Oh, and look out this week for an episode of The Underdogs. That is going to be for Patreon subscribers only, but it's just $3 a month. It gets you access to 2 or more, and these days it's usually or more, bonus episodes every month. And among those bonus episodes, some of them are part of a series called The Underdogs, where Bloody Elbows Phil McKenzie and I sort of break down journeymen and oddballs and underdogs, fighters who maybe don't get the acclaim that the A side usually get, but who certainly are worth talking about. We had a lot of performances from such fighters at UFC Auckland, namely, we had a great performance from Mizuto Hirota against Alexander Volkanovski that I mentioned before. We had a really nice veteran showing from John Moraga, shut down Ashkan Mokhtarian. We have some things to talk about there. And we're also going to be talking about Hideo Tokoro ahead of his Ryzen Bantamweight final bout against Kyoji Horiguchi. So make sure to keep your ears peeled for that. And otherwise, that is it for this episode of Heavy Hands. Thank you again to our subscribers and patrons. Thank you to everyone for listening to this. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.